This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, good afternoon. My name is Dom Green. I'm the Technical Advisor for Business Portfolio for City and Guilds. I've been in contact with the lead endpoint assessor as far as Insurance Practitioner standards concerned. We did ideally want to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, but unfortunately there would be a conflict of interest if it was seen that the lead would be supporting specific customers, i.e. Kaplan, on their own, and so unfortunately that can't happen. However, I've spoken in depth with Val, and so I can now support each and every customer, including Kaplan, with the same information. So just to point out then that the information I'm going to give you is generic. However, I would take particular note of assessment criteria, etc., which will be mentioned in this session. Can I just check that everybody can hear me all right, first of all, and can everybody see the screen? Just one person could confirm, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so without further ado, I just wanted to really cover the role of the endpoint assessor and the awarding organisation, how they might differ. It does have an impact on this particular standard quite significantly. So under the new Trailblazer standard, essentially, we as an awarding organisation, City and Guilds, our roles move from being, well, saying an awarding body, it was more about, and so an awarding body was perhaps more about quality assurance, perhaps of different training providers, the different processes and procedures that you run and use, and then what we would have then done is some limited sampling of assessment decisions. Of course, now we've moved over to endpoint assessment created by Trailblazer Groups. As an EPAO now, endpoint assessment organisation, we're now having to assess every learner. We have to apply the standard and the assessment criteria that's been developed by the employer group, i.e. the Trailblazer Group, a bit like having a mark scheme really for an exam. We have to be objective and consistent in how we apply these, so it's not just down to sampling. For the insurance standard, it's important that all the EPA submissions are essentially clear and sufficient. This standard is difficult. There's no opportunity to clarify anything with the learner, which is quite abnormal as far as standards are concerned. That makes your life specifically more difficult, really, against other standards, which means that the bar's been set by the employer group as being really high, and we are aware that it is a tough standard. This standard requires all the assessment criteria to have been fully evidenced as well across the portfolio and the reflective discussion. So what we're going to look at now is key requirements for endpoint assessment and some of the changes that we might need to consider regarding that new standard. With grading differences, obviously the mapping of behaviours across evidence. Obviously the assessment specifically is synoptic, which means we now need to consider all perspectives and factors related to the standard. We need to ensure that the ability to make links between more than one area of study, the actual assessment criteria itself, the experience or showing what we know, what the learners know, what's been learned, and that all comes together in that synoptic method. The assessments down to the IEPA, which will be allocated, so the IEPA being the independent endpoint assessor, but obviously we need to make sure that the quality checks are happening prior to that. Of course, the EPA is now at the end of the programme, which puts extra stresses on the learners themselves. So the two different assessment specifications, one being the portfolio and the other being the reflective or PD, professional discussion, both come up with by the Trailblazer Group. To point out that essentially the insurance practitioner standard is different to many other standards. The The training provider guides the learner in putting the portfolio together. So you obviously carry that out, and then you complete reflective discussion. So as I've already mentioned before, the IEPA has no opportunity to clarify really with the learner anything that's been learnt. It's therefore really important that everything is covered by the portfolio and by the reflective discussion itself. So what are the requirements for the portfolio? I'm going to focus just on level 3 really, because virtually all the EPAs so far have been level 3. So that's why we've decided to focus on this level. A minimum of 3 different types of evidence required as a minimum. A minimum of 70% of the learning outcomes must be evidenced. So by the portfolio itself, so that's 41 out of a total of 58 needs to be covered. Must cover 1 learning outcome per competency. So each competency must be covered at least once. Obviously, if it's only covered once, then that's not going to meet the minimum criteria of 70%. So we must make sure that there is evidence in there of each competency. We've also got to demonstrate the competence holistically. That goes without saying, that goes across many standards. So the knowledge, skills and behaviours together in a holistic manner should be assessed. We must demonstrate consistent performance for skills and behaviours. This is mentioned quite frequently in the assessment plan, the term consistent. Where it says consistent, then there must be more than one piece of evidence really to show that consistency has been adhered to. The actual evidence itself should comprise of work completed in the final assessment stage, i.e. post-gateway. I think to point out here that mostly these points have been met by the EPA submissions submitted to date, which is great. Occasionally, bullet point 3 is being missed, so must cover 1 learning outcome per competency. As I mentioned before, at least 1 piece of evidence must be 1 piece of learning out. 1 learning outcome must be met for each competency, otherwise it will be deemed as a fail. Often bullet point 4 is weak as well, the synoptic assessment. So as I mentioned before, it's looking to test all the knowledge, skills and behaviours together. The assessment plan states that apprentices are required to demonstrate their knowledge, skills and behaviours in an integrated manner to deliver the learning outcomes required to meet the standard. So for example, that might be providing an example of processing a claim, showing how it links to, say, insurance principles and FCA regulations. What we don't want is portfolios containing hundreds of individual pieces of evidence. There could be some of these, but most should cover multiple assessment criteria, and I think that's perhaps something that we don't necessarily see. It's really important, really, that we are mapping across to that standard with as little work as possible. And making the most out of that evidence. All the assessment criteria for the skills and behaviours are preceded with the learner consistently. So that's what it says in the assessment plan. So this means that most of the assessment criteria really should be evidenced with more than 1, like I mentioned before. The assessment plan is not prescriptive on this, but where it does say consistently, we'd expect to generally be looking for, say, a couple or 3 examples per assessment criteria. There's some weird or some different unusual assessment criteria actually in the assessment plan. 2.4.3, which is about identifying examples of non-compliance. Essentially, if we've got lots and lots in there, then we're doing something wrong. But we don't need to focus necessarily on the negatives where the company's perhaps been non-compliant. So maybe 1 example there will be sufficient. It's important to map each piece of evidence as widely as possible, so not reinventing the wheel, looking at a piece of evidence, looking at where it maps across to, obviously, but also where else can it map across into, even if it's a little bit tedious, that link. This is sometimes what we're not seeing sufficient of You've got some great case studies, but perhaps they could be mapped further and more fully in order to ensure consistency throughout. Okay, is everybody okay so far? Any questions at all? Just have a quick look on chat. There's no questions on the chat. Okay, we'll move on then really for hints and tips for that portfolio. Some areas to think about. Key areas then: a small number of robust pieces of evidence focusing on specific competencies. Probably the most effective method. Evidence can be written or voice recorded. If we are going to use voice recordings, ideally we'd like them to be mapped to say where in that voice recording is the evidence. We must obviously authenticate that evidence where possible, and obviously we need to redact information as well. However, if there's too much redaction going on, it might mean that the evidence isn't really appropriate to use, which is a difficult one. Consider screen sharing in support of voice recorded evidence. Maximize naturally occurring evidence, e.g. performance reviews and file audits. Witness testimonies are great, but should focus around the specific standard. If we're talking about areas that are not in the standard, it doesn't want to be in there. It should be cut out really. And of course, the skills and behaviours must be performance based. It's important really to plan evidence collection around the standard. Good practice would be for the portfolio to include, say, 3 to 4 case studies, plus the last performance review as well, updated by bi-monthly, one-to-ones where appropriate, maybe a manager witness testimony. If the learner's been involved in, say, project work, that could be really good evidence to put forward, maybe use as one of the case studies. I think Kaplan uses that approach, so it might be a point for action to focus on maximising that evidence to its potential, and by making sure it's mapped across to all relevant assessment criteria. Each case study should be chosen to showcase different competencies, so that the portfolio is built essentially progressively. What we don't want is lots and lots of case studies around the same areas of the assessment criteria, and so to think about that as the portfolio is built. So specific points really that could be key to improving things might be ensuring that the evidence covers all parts of the assessment criteria. So there's a specific example being passed over by Val here, the IEPA assessment criteria 1.1.3. Evidence must cover policy cover, extensions, limitations and exclusions. I think in the past we've seen some portfolios that perhaps have missed out, say, the exclusions part, so it's probably just about quality checking really. Considering keywords in the assessment criteria, we've mentioned obviously consistently already, but for example 1.1.2 requires the learner to briefly describe but must cover the products commonly available in the insurance market. So I think that's referring to if, say, the learner is in car insurance, not just focusing on their own role within the car insurance, but what other is available within the, what other products and services are available in the insurance market itself. Looking at context of the assessment criteria, some are about markets, products generally, others are about the learner's own role. So I think the key here is to compare 1.1.2 and 1.1.3, and of course making sure that that knowledge then is in the learner's own words. The assessment criteria given above really as examples are of really some areas that perhaps you might want to focus on to try and improve portfolios themselves. Further points really, taking care to correctly interpret the assessment criteria, some are theory based. So 1.2.1, the insurance principles means obviously the below: insurable interest, indemnity, utmost good faith, proximate cause, subrogation, contribution. 1.4.3, market agreements are different to regulatory requirements. Okay, so it might be 2 areas to focus on there specifically, and that making sure that examples are based on practical experience, and that are highlighting areas of good practice. Well, moving on to a good reflective or a good professional discussion. A reflective discussion, RD, is a form of structured interview. We've got to remember that it's a planned form of discussion. It's an opportunity to explore any gaps and weaknesses in the portfolio, and for the learner to talk about how they've progressed in their specific role. Don't really want the learner to go through what's in the portfolio, to repeat what's in the portfolio necessarily, but should cover the assessment criteria that's not already been evidenced in that, or only partially evidenced in that portfolio. It's there to test competence in the learner, and so it might be that we are delving down into that discussion to make sure that the learner can actually do that and prove their quality of the evidence, and that they actually understand it themselves. So the professional discussion will be completed after the portfolio has been finalised, and of course must be voice recorded. We've got to remember then that because that professional discussion is a planned discussion, it's an opportunity to address any gaps in that portfolio. I personally would make sure that you've gone through the discussion, what you're going to discuss with that learner prior to it actually happening, to make sure that the content is appropriate, and that you've planned it properly. It's not a general chat, so it should be planned appropriately. There's nothing wrong with planning it first, and making sure that the learner is fully up to speed with their own portfolio as well. That would clearly help that learner immensely. Essentially then, it's an opportunity to address any gaps in that portfolio and to confirm competence by the learner. It should last between 30 and 60 minutes typically, planned and structured around that assessment criteria. The learner should always be put at ease to start off with, and of course essential elements appropriately introduced to make sure we know who's there, the date, sufficiently detailed, covers specific examples. Obviously the examples need to conform to VAX or VARCs, so valid, authentic, current, sufficient. So we need to ensure that the examples are current, recent, for instance, and that obviously we're not leading any questions there to guide the learner. If the learner's guided, then it's moving away more from a discussion to a Q&A, which is not appropriate. It's well, like I said before, we're not there to, the professional discussion is not there to just repeat the portfolio itself. It is about potentially getting new evidence out of the learner. Try not to spend too long talking about the learner journey. The most important aspects focus on closing gaps, weaknesses in the portfolio, or indeed strengths. It's not just about weaknesses. It might be to upskill the learner. There might be borderline distinction criteria evidence there, and it might be to ensure that competence is there at distinction standard and to actually upskill them. And of course, the learner can bring new evidence to the table on top of that portfolio itself. Moving on to grading, we're now going to look at really how the grading of the standard under the new Trailblazer or employer group standard works. As I mentioned before, the insurance practitioner is a difficult standard as far as grading is concerned, because we don't get a chance to see the learner necessarily, and therefore what we're given is the evidence that we must assess on. So the grading criteria for level 3 is fail, pass or distinction. Obviously there's no merit in there. It's there to it's determined, so the assessment decision made by the endpoint assessor is there, and it's determined by both methods of assessment, so the portfolio and reflective discussion. The problem we've got is that if one or more of the assessment criteria hasn't been met, then it's automatically a fail. And that's where really the quality checks needs to happen across the board to make sure that somebody else has got a set of eyes on the evidence that's going forward, to make sure that the assessment criteria have all been met, or at least one piece of evidence within each competency has been met. In order to achieve a pass, then all pass assessment criteria must be met. 70% of the assessment criteria must be evidenced by the portfolio, so 41 out of 58, including one per competency. And as far as distinction is concerned, all the pass criteria met plus 18 or more distinction criteria at least. And obviously there's got to be at least one distinction criteria within that competency. Again, it's a high bar, unfortunately, and there's no real leeway there at all. So that's why it's so demanding, but it is essentially achievable, and that's what we've got to remember. Okay, finally, things to consider. Identify learners who are capable of achieving a distinction and present specific evidence. If that learner is capable of achieving a distinction, it's about the importance really of guiding them when putting that portfolio together, allowing them really to explicitly evidence that distinction differentiators, and making sure that what I would do is read through that assessment plan, looking at those differentiators and really highlight them within that evidence, within that showcase portfolio, to ensure that the learner is there evidencing those distinction descriptors, to ensure that they get over the line for that. And of course, we're all aiming for distinctions for each of our learners, so teaching up to distinction criteria, and then with the fallback of a pass. Okay, essentially that's a brief overview really of where we're up to with the insurance practitioner. Not to forget that there are other sources of support. There is access on smart screen to centre guides. There are checklists for both the provider, the employer and the apprentice, actually, well worth a view. And there's also some exemplar documents on smart screen. There is EPA handbooks, etc. Exemplar material can be accessed via the smart screen EPA tab. If you're struggling to get on that at all, let myself know, and I'll get in touch with a business manager who can then get you access to the exemplar and preparation tool. Okay, Marie, I don't know if you have access to exemplar and preparation tool or not.
I haven't myself, but I think our administration team do, so I can have a look at that. But if not, I'll get back in contact with you. Not a problem.
Yeah. Sometimes it gets sent to the wrong person,
Yeah.
and so it's not always accessible. But if that is the case, if you just get back in touch, and I'll reset it. I'll get somebody in customer service to set it up for you again.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Is there any questions at all that I might be able to answer? If not, then I can take the questions back to the LEPA, the lead independent assessor, and then I can get back to you at a later date. Just looking on the chat, there's no questions up there at the moment. Has anybody got any questions at all about the slide deck?
I had one, if that's okay.
Yep, sure. Hi, Jade.
So, hi. Thank you for putting this on today as well, just as a quick message. My question really is about the knowledge element. So,
Yep.
You've mentioned 1.4.3, which I think is a real key one that some learners kind of can get stuck on. When you're asking for things like market agreements, do they have to show a plethora of examples of market agreements, or just kind of touch on which ones actually specifically relate to their role? So if they do GTA in motor, that would be the only one that they could potentially talk about?
It depends really on how it links to that assessment criteria. So not knowing off the top of my head where it sits within the assessment plan, if it highlights others, you will need to mention the others as well.
Right. Okay.
It's certainly worth getting the learner to do a comparison or mentioning competitors, for instance, or other products and services if they're in the assessment plan. Just to make sure.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions at all? If there are questions that you think of after the event, Marie, I don't know if you wanted to perhaps
I'll collect them. Yeah, I'll collect any questions. If you can send the recording through, because it might be that some of the people that have not been able to make today's session, it might be that they've got some questions. So what I'll do is if you can send the recording through, I'll send it out to everybody and ask for any questions that they've got and bring them straight back to you.
Not a problem. I can then get the relevant answers off the lead endpoint assessor.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you ever so much for today. We do really appreciate it.
Thank you for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Speak to you soon. Bye.
Bye.